This is the story of a man who struggled for all and brought reconciliation to his troubled land. A man who spent a lifetime in prison for his beliefs. When he emerged, a number of Herculean tasks lay ahead. This led to more than a few uncomfortable compromises. This is the story of Nelson Mandela and how he tackled a beast called business.
I was always amazed after we became friends what a good practical politician he was. He didn't spend all that time in prison thinking about his immortal soul. He spent some time thinking about how to make deals and get things done.
And deals were done with financial wizards and former foes. Socialism was all but abandoned and a free market economy was born amid compromises. Some inevitable, some pragmatic, many unpopular.
What is still in dispute is whether all the compromises that were made were necessary. There are those who argue that Mandela and the ANC gave too much.
It was a story that began in 1918 when Mandela was born in the rolling hills of the former Transkei. The son of a chief, grew up with a sense of leadership and destiny. He was expected to marry the woman of his family's choice, but he held a burning desire to become a lawyer and in the 1940s fled to the bright lights of Johannesburg. Johannesburg was in the middle of a wartime boom. This was also apartheid South Africa, a difficult place for a black man to fit in other than as cheap labour. Mandela's first lowly job was in the mines. The only way was up.
He arrived in Johannesburg as a young man in 1941, and it was a very vibrant city, and he fitted right into it. He was ambitious politically, he was ambitious for himself, and he was starting a family and all kinds of things going on in his personal life. He used to go to this particular tailor's where white people had been going for years, rich white Jewish people, and he didn't care about that. He was going to go there himself and be fitted for suits. This famous South African human rights lawyer George Bezos described seeing him in this tailor's one day called Khan's being fitted, and there's this tailor at this white Jewish tailor at Mandela's feet. He's standing there, being fitted, and you just you didn't very often see white people at black people's feet in those days in South Africa. So already Mandela was creating waves as a young man in the very early stages of his development.
When I first met Nelson, he was stunning, absolutely stunning man, tall, imposing, just totally and utterly charming.
Inspiration was in the air, and the sight of educated black professionals in Johannesburg spurred on Mandela in his law studies. In this building in downtown Johannesburg, Chancellor House, he founded the first black legal practice in South Africa with future ANC leader Oliver Tambo. It was a tall order in a society built on white supremacy.
Nelson said when he'd go to court, the white lawyers would pretend they didn't notice him. Now, it's almost impossible not to notice a man of this stature, of the way in which he walked, his proud being, immaculate dress.
Fighting for the downtrodden inevitably led to politics and the African National Congress, a multiracial and non-violent liberation movement formed less than half a century before.
Nelson loves a fight. We used to send him out to go and wag his finger at them.
Mandela rose to lead the ANC Youth League and immersed himself in the stirrings of the post-war struggle. When the movement defied the past laws, Mandela was made first volunteer for arrest. It led to the treason trial at the end of the 1950s. It lasted for years here at this Pretoria synagogue.
Here we were in the upstairs session looking downstairs on Nelson and Dumanukwe, and the two of them were reading Afrikaans fairy tales, or fairy tales in Afrikaans, because they were trying to learn Afrikaans. I thought that's a very good way of learning a language.
The accused were acquitted on charges of high treason in early 1961. Nelson Mandela then went underground and hid out at Liliesleaf in Rivonia on the outskirts of Johannesburg. Here he posed as a gardener at a safe house, masquerading as a working farm. In these shadowy days, one step ahead of the police, he earned the nickname the Black Pimpernel.
I asked him what it was that the African really wanted.
This interview with a British journalist was carried out while he was on the run. A hint at the armed struggle to come.
There are many people who feel that the reaction of the government to our stay at home, ordering a general mobilization, arming the white community, arresting 10,000s of Africans, the show of force throughout the country, notwithstanding our clear declaration that this campaign is being run on peaceful and non-violent lines, close the chapter as far as our methods of political struggle are concerned. There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks.
Nelson Mandela was no soldier, but he was put in charge of the military wing of the ANC, Umkhonto weSizwe, the spear of the nation. On December 16, 1961, they went into action, planting bombs across the country. The crackdown by the authorities was severe and the arrests numerous. Near the end of 1962, Mandela was arrested at a roadblock in KwaZulu-Natal. He was sentenced to 5 years for organising strikes and leaving the country illegally. The following year, police raided Liliesleaf and rounded up the leadership of the underground. Months later, they stood in this courtroom at the Palace of Justice in Pretoria, charged with sabotage.
It was midwinter, and I remember he was wearing prison clothes, which were short trousers. He was in short trousers, and the idea of putting people into short trousers was really to humiliate them. But it was impossible to humiliate Mr. Mandela. He had this tremendous dignity, which transcended anything anyone could do to him. And from the very beginning of our very first meeting and discussions with everybody, it was clear that everybody respected him and saw him as a leader, whereas he in turn respected them and insisted on decisions being taken by discussion and consensus and not imposed upon anyone. And throughout the trial there was that collegiality and discussion.
In the shadow of the death penalty, he made one of the world's most famous speeches.
I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an idea for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But if it needs be, it is an idea for which I am prepared to die.
Our clients captured the world opinion, and I think the moment of Mr. Mandela's speech was extraordinarily dramatic. And the speech itself was a wonderful speech. It lasted for about 6 hours. The court was packed, but people were silent. And then at the very end, when he said that these were ideals for which he had struggled and hoped to live for, but if needs be, he was prepared to die, there was a dramatic silence which you could actually hear the silence in the court and feel it. And it was absolutely quiet, not a sound. And then the judge said, Mr. Fisher, you can call your next witness.
A moment that changed millions of minds around the world. Nelson Mandela and his fellow accused were now seen by many as freedom fighters rather than criminals. Their necks were saved, but they were to be flown through the night to begin a lifetime of incarceration on Robben Island off Cape Town. Businessman Gabi Mahomola, then a teenager serving 6 years for attending political meetings, saw Mandela take his first steps in prison.
Lo and behold, 30 minutes after the plane had landed, we see these prisoners. It's this huge noise and commotion and dogs, and so we all go out, and there's this tall man leading a group of people that we had only seen in the newspapers or read about, you know. And as he drew closer, we realized it was Nelson Mandela himself. He was like a demigod. He was, you know, the strange thing is that because of his stature, you would the last thing you expected to see him in was in shorts and in a humiliating condition in which they were all placed, including us, of course, but more for them. But the dignity surrounding him could not escape anyone. I mean, we were petrified, you know, just to get that close to him, to see him in flesh. It was almost like, I don't know, you know, like you're seeing the Almighty himself.
Time moved slowly on Robben Island and the struggle marched on.
The imprisonment of Nelson Mandela was not the imprisonment of an individual. It was the imprisonment of a man, his comrades, and the dreams of a people for liberation.
By early 1990, the writing was on the wall for apartheid, and in prison, Mandela was thinking, planning and preparing. One of the strange sources he summoned to help him was Clem Santa, a Cambridge-educated strategist who was then a senior manager at Anglo-American, a pillar of apartheid.
It started with a phone call, I think in November 1989. I was sitting in my office and somebody said to me, there's a phone call from the police. So my obvious reaction was, what on earth have I done? And the person at the other end of the phone said, there's a prisoner who'd like to speak to you. And I said, I don't know any prisoners. So he said, you know this one? So I said, who? So he said, Nelson Mandela. So I said, you're kidding. So he said, no, he would like to see you. So I said, when? So he said, anytime. I thought it was going to be about the past. And, you know, at the time I was the head of corporate affairs for Anglo-American, and I thought, you know, I was going to be asked about Anglo-American and its role in the economy and the mining industry and migrant labor, instead of which he wanted to talk about the future and talk about particularly the kind of where you become a winning nation in the global economy. So it was much more around the sort of current state of affairs in the world and how one can position South Africa to basically go on a high economic growth path than actually dwelling on past injustices. His whole persona, style, everything about him is that he was a fox, that he didn't actually wed himself to one idea like a hedgehog. He actually had lots of different ideas in his mind, and he was juggling them up, and he was taking everybody's perspective in order to reach a balanced opinion about the future.
It all built up to a day that would go down in history. February the 11th, 1990.
It is not a man who walked out of Victor Verster prison, but a man together with the aspirations of millions of people who were oppressed.
A day longed for by many of his former neighbours and comrades in Vilakazi Street, Soweto.
So when he was released, I hoped that I would walk up and down Vilakazi Street and see Nelson Mandela and Winnie Mandela hand in hand. That never happened. But the entire area was crazy. Full of people. Hooters blaring, people singing, people running up and down the streets. And at the end of the day, of course, people were disappointed when they were told Nelson Mandela would not spend his first night at his old house. Indescribable. I mean, you can't describe the atmosphere. Even people who were not political were seized by the excitement and the atmosphere. If the second coming indeed does happen, I think the only thing you can compare the second coming to in terms of expectations and the stature of the man would be what people expected on that day.
According to many of the political prisoners of South Africa, the jailers used to taunt them that they would only leave prison feet first in a coffin. Therefore, this walk from Victor Verster was meant to be as symbolic as it was joyful. Pride and inner strength that Mandela would need as he shaped up to the job of building anew. At the head of a bitterly divided nation, he had the thankless job of balancing and exacting the demands of business with the aspirations of the poor. In this, he could neither afford to alienate members of the white establishment nor his comrades in the struggle. Grappling with the beast called business needed nerve and skill. The euphoria of the release gave way to cold reality. Ahead lay many tough negotiations with government. Beyond this, there was a democratic society to build.
In the name of the heroic struggle of our people.
Millions needed homes, schools and jobs. The South African economy of the early 1990s suffered from the hangover of years of stagnation and sanctions.
One needs to distinguish between the different eras of the apartheid period. In the 1960s, the apartheid government embarked upon inward industrialization, imposed almost sanctions upon itself, huge import tariffs to try and promote local industry to do everything, including the building of a whole lot of armaments and armed vehicles and the like. And this created a huge boom in the economy, where the average growth rate was in the region of 5.5%, 6%. However, what was not foreseen were the detrimental consequences of such action, including the fact that a lot of South African businesses became accustomed to these protective barriers and became increasingly inefficient.
Of course, we couldn't get the brand names. We couldn't get anything from Boss to Prada to any of those brand names. Now they all came back. And if you walk through Sandton City and you look at the number of shops that are represented here, international brands, none of that was available at that stage. Nobody wanted to be associated. None of the big brands wanted to be associated with South Africa simply because of what it would cost them in publicity on the other side.
Also, you had the imposition of foreign exchange controls, which resulted in financial institutions accumulating cash that they could not invest elsewhere, and they were driven to invest that cash in buying up shares in bigger and larger companies in South Africa, so that you had the development of huge oligopolies or monopolies in all sorts of industries, and associations between banking groups, mining groups, insurance groups, food groups, packaging, paper groups, which really didn't make any sense and impeded the competitive processes in the economy. The result was that the 1970s saw a progressive decline in economic growth to around 3.5% per year, and by the 1980s that fell still further to less than 1% per year annual growth.
To change all of this was going to be a huge battle. This was where the first skirmishes were fought out. Vilakazi Street, Soweto, Mandela's former home, now a museum, where the future president sat and waited for business to beat a path to his door.
It felt like he was the king of the country. He was like an emperor. He was like, I mean, everyone, first of all, understand this, you know, the entire media of the world had descended on Vilakazi Street in Orlando.
One of the first people there was Gabi Mahomola, who had been on Robben Island with Mandela and had since made a name for himself in business.
Anyone that could possibly make it to Vilakazi Street was there. And people would be there 24 hours a day. I can recall on the first occasion when I went there to visit with him, I was met by Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa and my friend Zulaki Sisulu, the son of Mr. Walter Sisulu. They were at the gate, and they jokingly wanted to know, Cyril wanted to know whether I'd come to, you know, peddle my capitalism.
But many of those who had fought the struggle in the streets of Soweto were not amused.
I would be lying if I said there was no resentment on the part of those of us who felt they had done enough to meet him face to face, because meeting him was impossible. Getting through the gatekeepers to meet him was very difficult.
I arrived there at the same time with Governor Raleigh, the chairman of Anglo, and he told me that you know, he had been invited to come and debate and this issue of nationalization, something that has reared its head again in South African politics, was discussed just after Madiba was released, and the privatization of mines and so on and so forth. And I think that is something that concerned him, because being the visionary that he is, he probably worried about the you know, investor confidence levels.
With that worry in mind, Nelson Mandela faced the difficult job of going against the Freedom Charter, those words set in stone by the ANC that sustained many through the years of struggle with the promise of a better life. The people shall govern. All shall share equal rights. The tricky words for business were, the mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks, and monopoly industry shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole. That meant nationalization and a slap in the face for investors. The other route was likely to anger the people. Inspiration came from an unlikely source thousands of miles away in the snows of Switzerland.
Clinton spoke first, and he was president, and got a polite clap for a few minutes, and then Blair spoke for an hour, spoke very well indeed, got a polite clap for a few minutes, and then Mandela walked onto the stage and got a 10-minute standing ovation without saying a word.
The World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. The then editor of The Star in Johannesburg, Peter Sullivan, was there.
Many people say, well, it doesn't achieve anything. And then Klaus Schwab, who runs the place, always trots out the fact that, well, you know, Mr. Mandela had dinner here one night and explained to us why everything should be nationalized. And people then explained to him why not. And the next morning, says Klaus in his sort of very German accent, the next morning he has changed his mind and it has changed the whole of South Africa. You know.
Once that speech was made out there in Europe, the ANC had to scurry around and find a way of making what he said the reality of going forward. And in a sense, maybe he was influenced by what he was seeing happening all over the world, the rollback of socialism or communism, whatever people want to call it.
And when you speak to Mr. Mandela about it, he says, yes, Peter, he says, there were some very clever people talking to this stupid old man and explaining why what I believed was outdated on nationalization, he said. I went to sleep, and they were very polite in pointing out that I had been asleep for 27 years. He said. But I went to sleep that night, and the next morning I woke up and I realized.
The issue around deciding that all this talk around socialism makes good speeches but does not make good economic sense. he must have been proved right. We are where we are today, a better country. I'm not convinced that if socialism as a macroeconomic policy framework had been adopted, we would be where we are today. I think we wouldn't be here. We would be in a worse situation than where we are.
The die was cast. A democratic South Africa was to be a free market economy. In the years following Nelson Mandela's election, the changes moved apace. March 1995, South Africa scrapped the financial rand, a restrictive way of selling shares, opening up the flow of foreign investment. July 1995, institutional investors were allowed to invest abroad. June 1996 saw the relaxation of limits for foreign investors on domestic borrowing. The taps were open and foreign investment was flowing. One of the first institutions to feel the benefit was the liberalised and revitalised Johannesburg Stock Exchange as the money flowed in.
When I look at our volumes of 10 billion rand and 20 billion rand today and the amount of trading that we're doing, of course that didn't exist. It was a very small open outcry market. Naturally in 1994 with the with the democratic election here and a democratic government, things opened up as well, which allowed the JSE to deregulate. We had foreign banks coming in, and then it was a club. It was you had partnerships owned by partners, of course, limited capital. So we were nowhere near the size that we are today.
Nelson Mandela drew South Africa towards a market economy. The next tricky job was to convince the millions of black people who'd been excluded for generations that they were to eventually get their fair share. In the late 1990s, Nelson Mandela surprised the world by steering his country's economy away from socialism towards a free market economy. It set the tone for an economy that thrived under his successor, President Thabo Mbeki. The next tricky step was to convince the majority black population that it too was going to get a share of this growing new economy. The economy was still run by a wealthy and powerful white elite. The short-term answer was affirmative action, the promotion of black leadership and ownership. The plan was to get companies to sell a slice of their business to people who were unable to vote before 1994. Gabi Makomola was one of them. In the 1960s, he was a young activist who spent 2 years on Robben Island.
But this was a very lonely place to be.
When he came out, he was banished to here, to Klo, in the country's remote Limpopo province.
I had just come out of prison. I was wearing a brand new set of clothes, brand new shoes. I remember the first day when we arrived here, myself and Baker Mukhale. The people thought we came from the department, from the government department. We were mistaken for some officers who had come to improve the lot of the workers. And people were crowding around us trying to tell us how terrible things were here. Get us out of here, do something about our plight, And Baker and I kind of just looked at each other in the face and said, if only they knew, we're coming to join them as laborers as well.
This was his home for 2 years. This is his first return after a lifetime.
I've almost closed off this place. It's almost like I'm going through an aberration of a dream of some sort. It doesn't seem real, it's 40 years later.
Gabi Makomola emerged from banishment to embark on a remarkable career that saw him become a trader on Wall Street. When he returned home, he became one of the early champions of black empowerment.
My theme was about, let's pull ourselves out by our bootstraps as an African nation in South Africa and prepare ourselves for the day when freedom dawned. Around that period then, in the 80s, the rules on Robben Island had been liberalized. People were allowed television, they were allowed newspapers to some extent. And my message, I was told by them, was reaching them in their cells in prison. And it came as no surprise, therefore, when Nelson Mandela was released, that I was invited to come to his house.
But implementation was more difficult. South Africa's black empowerment policy has made many new millionaires, but few entrepreneurs. It has been plagued by accusations that it merely benefits the few in an economy still largely run by white business.
The African Bank had a huge difficulty in just establishing itself as a bank under apartheid, to a point where the laws did not allow in South Africa for a bank to be owned by black people. Simple. So Sam Mutswenyane, Ntato Motlana, and a whole host of other people felt there was a need for a bank that was an African bank. So they established it, and it was headquartered in Garankuwa in Buputa, Tswana. But in order for that bank to even start up, they needed to raise 1 million. It took them 10 years.
Laws have been made to transfer more than a quarter of the mining industry into black ownership. Many accuse South Africa of being too slow to push black business interests.
Too little is happening. And the fact that too little is happening, there is a lot of disturbances in society, and you can feel that extreme views are beginning to come up, and those extreme views are going to be a lot more damaging to the industry than if the state was to apply the law and apply it stringently to ensure that the objectives are achieved.
Just one of the many business issues Nelson Mandela had to juggle as he ran a new democracy. Many of these matters brought him into conflict with journalists. Peter Sullivan and Matata Sedu were editors of major South African newspapers in the Mandela years.
We had a lot of clashes. The Star runs stories every day which he disagrees with, and he used to phone up and say, I disagree with that story.
Many a time I was at the receiving end of his lashing tongue. He had a particular way of dealing with people who he was disagreeing with. In my case, I would be invited for breakfast at his house. So I've been to breakfast in Houghton several times. The first time, I didn't have any idea. When I got the second invite for breakfast, I got there quite prepared for the worst.
You have written that I will only be remembered for divorcing my wife, not for anything else. I said to him, oh, you're talking absolute rot. I'm terribly sorry, Mr. President, I sound rude, but you're just talking rubbish. He said, we will have to take this up some other time. But I want you to know that I'm very angry with the way that things have been running in the paper. And I was furious. I came home, I drove back from Pretoria still in a fury, and I sat down and I wrote him a letter, a really angry letter, saying, how dare you say these things in front of my colleagues? He said, why don't you come for breakfast instead? So I said, I'll come to breakfast as long as I can give you the letter. He said, okay, fine. So I went to breakfast, I handed over the letter. He took the letter, he put it down upside down. He said, I might read this and I might not. That's yesterday's business. He said, I have other things I want to discuss with you. I said, but I'm angry about those things. He said, yes, but they will sort themselves out. He said, I asked after lunch for them to find where you had written that I will only be remembered for divorcing Winnie. He said, and they couldn't find it. So perhaps I was wrong.
It's Mandela, it's the old man, it's daddy, it's granddad, it's utata, so we all just cower and say, he must know.
Through the difficult times and clashes, President Nelson Mandela kept in touch and moving forward.
I just think that much as he is a man who consults, there are times when he realizes that this consultation is just going to drag on for a while. He's going to take leadership, make the decision, live with the consequences. And I think in his own calculations, he knew that because of who he was, even if people disagreed, they would be muted.
Literally any politician believes that their picture should be on every single page from the front to the back of the paper. And the story should all be about what they're doing, and especially if you're president of a country. And Mandela was no different. I mean, he was like most presidents. They believe what they do is really big news and we should be carrying it. And sometimes it's not big news, and sometimes there are other things that happen in the world that sort of take precedence. But as a president to work with, I've worked with quite a few and I've fought with a lot. I've fought with all of them, actually. He was the nicest.
It was to be one short term in office for Nelson Mandela. He stood down in 1999, leaving a legacy in business and politics that many leaders around the world would envy. In the years Nelson Mandela spent in office, his image became big business. A worldwide name as good as gold.
To give you some idea of the size, we've calculated that the coin market, i.e. coins minted by the South African Mint, such as the Mandela coins, the democracy coins, and various other denominations and limited editions, is worth about 750 million rand. And by the same token, we calculate that the Mandela medallion market today is worth some 750 million. So in total, probably you're looking at 1.5 billion rand today.
Ironically, when Mandela coins first came out in 1994, they were not so popular.
It first started in 1994 when Education Africa brought out the first Mandela medallion. It was a 1/10 medallion. They had limited success with it, and in fact many years later they melted most of these medallions because there wasn't much demand for them. He had just been released from prison a few years previously. This was the first government. At that time he was a politician and the president, and I suppose people were unsure of his credentials, and it was only over time, and of course after leaving office after one term, that his status improved and increased, and his iconic status has really zoomed in the last 5 or 10 years.
And in his short stay in power, he made strides in reform, freeing up a lumbering state-controlled economy. A generation on, the gap between rich and poor is wider than ever. Millions are shouting ever more loudly for a better life. One of the economic questions of the 21st century: did South Africa make the right choice?
Well, I think it was a good choice, not the ideal choice. Look, compromises were made throughout the negotiation process and after the negotiation process. What is still in dispute is whether all the compromises that were made were necessary. There are those who argue that Mandela and the ANC gave too much.
Obviously, if it had gone the other way and we'd had the Freedom Charter, it would have been exactly like Zimbabwe. I mean, I've done some strategy work in Zimbabwe, and what really has come across in that is that the 90s were a fantastic period for Zim. They had 6 to 7% economic growth for most of the 90s. But then the first land invasion happened at the end of the 90s. And it wasn't a shrinking out, it was like hitting the wall. It just went down. And I think that's exactly what would have happened to South Africa.
Under the stewardship of Mbeki and his appointee Trevor Manuel subsequently, government actually extricated the country from a huge mess that has been created by overspending in the last few years of the apartheid regime. And the government embarked upon massive fiscal discipline, which has been criticized frequently, but is now enabling us to withstand the ravages of the global financial and economic crisis far better than many advanced economies, because our government debt levels are so much lower than theirs.
I think the fact that the economy, even in times of uncertainty, and this economy has demonstrated a huge amount of resilience. The fact that, yes, we did not attract as much foreign direct investment as we could have, but we have, notwithstanding, attracted quite a bit of foreign capital inflows into the country, is a consequence of the insights and the leadership of Madiba.
I think we've slipped a lot. I think we've let it go. There's a lot of work to do to, it's still a good economy, and it's still probably the biggest economy in in Africa. But I think it's something we could have worked on. That itself is a whole other discussion. But I don't think we took full advantage of the inflows or the attention that we gained from Mandela's release and Mandela as an icon. We didn't play on it. I think we allowed a lot of that to go.
In truth, Nelson Mandela's legacy lies in reconciliation, how he took a nation and attempted to heal it. In this, he proffered the hand of comradeship to everyone, including former political foes, like apartheid cabinet minister Pik Botha, whom he visited in hospital.
I woke up with him by my side, holding my hand, and saying to me, "Look, Pik, I've gone through the same ordeal. Get well, you're okay. You still got work to do. We're looking forward to your complete recovery." Now, this is amazing. I served in his cabinet for 2 years. We got to know each other during the negotiating period. We often had one-on-one meetings with one another, where he requested to meet me alone, and where we would then meet and talk about sensitive matters, straight from the heart.
But he was never a man for himself. He was totally unconcerned with money and with all the trappings of wealth. He didn't want a big car. He didn't want any of that stuff. He just had what was necessary and what he was told to have. He really worried about his ideas, his own philosophy, his beliefs, the incredible belief that he has that everybody is good, that there's good in everybody, and that we should react to that goodness in everybody. The reconciliation was his watchword. If you talk about Gandhi, one tends to think of passive resistance, right? If you talk about Mandela, it's reconciliation. And he believes everybody can be reconciled. I mean, he was reconciled with the guys who put him in jail. He went to see Betsy Verster. He believed all of us should have reconciliation as our watchword in South Africa. And I think he's very worried that that's going to go away.
Here was a man, 27 years out of society. He became president and he governs the country as if he never spent a day in prison.
Nelson Mandela's image and charisma travelled the globe. It was undoubtedly a factor in securing the 2010 World Cup for Africa. It brought millions of dollars to South Africa and a resurgence in adulation for a man who had left power years before.
Nelson Mandela, we love you. If it hadn't been you, this World Cup wouldn't have come to Africa. We respect you, we love you, we say peace. May you live long. If you want to live to 1,000, we support you. You are a great man, you are a hero, you are love, and you are peace. We love you, Nelson Mandela.
We want to let him know that people all over the world love him, especially Africans. We appreciate all his sacrifice for independence struggle, for freedom and justice all over the world.
He changed things, but the real change is happening right now. His legacy is being put into practice, and it's quite ironic because, the World Cup was never considered trickle-down economics. It never really brought an economic benefit to people as such, but it's bringing you a very, very big benefit, and one that's very difficult to measure, both in terms of business, but also I think in terms of psychology. There is a sense, I think you've given everybody across the continent that we can do anything.
Behind all of this was Nelson Mandela's charm and connection with the people. When a children's programme made him man of the 20th century, he was the coolest man in the studio in more ways than one.
In the countryside where I grew up, the most important game at the time was stick play.
One of his trademark greetings was "Hello, young people," whether his audience was age 5 or 50. He always made time for children, even at a formal state banquet.
Mandela asking my daughters to dance and then dancing with them. Once we were at some function and he saw them and he said, "Come and dance." And very little big-eyed girls kind of go dance the famous Madiba shuffle with him.
He was at ease with queens and princes.
I remember being in London when he was there, when he had that state visit, and I remember seeing him riding past in a car, I think sitting next to the Queen, and I thought, it's not possible. It's not possible. Nelson Mandela is sitting next to the Queen of England. I'm not a royalist, but it's like it's amazing. And he was not fazed by his fame, not at all.
The big names of the world bathed in reflected glory, not always appreciated by those who cherished his ideals.
You still hear people complaining about how celebrities, local and international, and other luminaries, whether in business or elsewhere in South African life, sought an audience with him and got it. And people who were in the struggle, who wanted 5 minutes with him, couldn't. But as I matured, I took the philosophical view that he belonged to the world, not to the ANC, not even to South Africa. And it's not an equal world, is it?
When he had his 85th birthday, and it was done, the big bash was at Sandton Convention Center. Coke was one of the big sponsors of that thing. And there was an abuse of Mandela the person and Mandela the name in a way that was really sickening. He had been reduced to some form of Coke-like commodity, almost like Coke owned him because they've put this money there. I remember during the evening, the ceremony in the evening, the Coke guy going and sitting somewhere, standing up and squatting somewhere with a Coke bottle and saying, "This is the drink that Mandela drank when he was in jail." And I'm saying, please, don't do this to us.
One of the sad things for me is that I've never had a face-to-face meeting with Mandela. I have been at a venue where he was, but I was one of many people. But it's quite interesting how affected I was by him entering the venue. In fact, I cried when he entered the venue. I still can't explain why I cried.
Nelson Mandela rarely failed to stir emotion. A man meant so much to so many, who will be remembered the world over largely for being his humble self.
One workshop after the other to try and distill the essence of the Mandela legacy. As I say, he's lived such an integrated life. I always think, being a literary scholar, about when I think about him, I think about the great modern novel where they say the quality of it depends upon the amount and diversity of material integrated, and that to me is Mandela. So a single legacy, I mean, we South Africans will remember him for the way for reconciliation, for how he's held us together, for his forgivingness. I also like to remember him as the fiery, brave freedom fighter, for example. And those two things sometimes look to be at odds with one another, but he's integrated that into his life. But a basic thing about Mandela, and it's not even a philosophy, is that he sincerely believes that human beings are good-doing beings. He insists that human beings, for most of the time, do good, and when they err, it is an exception. And not many of us believe that, but he genuinely believes that.
You know the story of Moses? I might sound a bit evangelical, but the truth of the matter is that I think that he will be remembered as not only a leader that took us out of the depths of hell from whence we come, but as a leader that put the African continent at a level where those who had condemned us as a continent are able to stand back and say, wow, look at those people. The so-called dark continent suddenly has a light hovering over it, and that light comes from Madiba.
Mandela will become a saint. He will be very much like Gandhi. People will walk in his footsteps. Wherever he's been, wherever he's touched, will become sort of icons, which is exactly what he doesn't want. What he really wanted was for people to remember what he stood for. In the same as Gandhi. I'm sure Gandhi didn't want to be a saint. Gandhi wanted everybody to believe in passive resistance if you want something. No violence. I think Mandela wants everybody to believe in reconciliation. But in order to be reconciled, sometimes you have to be punished, and sometimes you have to do good deeds, and sometimes you have to do all sorts of other things. But unfortunately, whatever you want doesn't happen in this world. And what will happen is he will be elevated to a saint, and people will think that everything he said was wonderful and fantastic, and they'll only remember the good things.
When I saw him last year, I said to him, had you any notion of that you would become this great icon? And how is it to be? He shrugged his shoulders and smiled.
When the Constitutional Court was being inaugurated, there was a formal ceremony at which Mr. Mandela came and as head of government, and the Speaker as head of Parliament, and the three arms of government were noting and recognizing the inauguration of the new Constitutional Court, and there were a lot of other dignitaries present and a lot of lawyers and others. And Mr. Mandela spoke on that occasion. He sat on the bench, he sat next to me on the bench, and I remember he started by saying, the last time I was in a court, it was to hear whether or not I was going to be sentenced to death. That's how he started his comments. But the next day we were going to consider whether or not capital punishment was consistent with the Constitution. So it was quite a dramatic opening. And well, if he had been executed, what would have happened?
Nelson Mandela, a man who reconciled a nation and brought peace. He grappled with a beast called business and ushered in prosperity and stability. Few could have tackled all of this and carried it off with such class.